Okay, Alex, I think we're at 10 o'clock, everyone. So Alex, if you wouldn't mind introducing Dr. Vassányi.
Yeah, certainly. Our next speaker is Dr. Miklós Vassányi. He is an associate professor at the Károly Gáspár University of the Reformed Church in Hungary. His areas of interest include early modern and modern philosophy, metaphysics and the philosophy of religion, early Byzantine theology, and late Greek Neoplatonism. In the past few years, he's been working on an English language philosophical commentary to the De Divinis Nomnibus, as well as the first Hungarian translation of the same. He has been researching the potential Syriac background and sources of Denis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vassányi, who will be presenting on ontological prayer in part 3 of On the Divine Names and the Syriac tradition.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you especially to Samuel for the organization and the possibility to participate. I'm joining you from Hungary. It is late afternoon in this country, and I would like to share my screen with you. I have prepared a presentation, so if the settings allow me to share, then in principle, you can now see the presentation. Okay, so let me just start. The ontological prayer in part 3 of Genesis on the divine names and the Syriac tradition with a special respect to Afrahat, the Book of Steps, and Saint Ephraim's hymns on prayer. Chapter 1 of okay, can you still see the full screen? I think I should restart and share the full screen mode of my presentation, which is probably this. No, this is not it, because otherwise you will not be able to follow as I'm stepping forward. So let me see. Anyways, so this is the opening page. Can you see now the second slide, Sam, with a Greek text?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, then I'll just keep my settings like that. So chapter 1 of part 3 of On the Divine Names opens with the compound imperative that one, research into the divine names must start with the good. Because as a kind of umbrella term, it best covers all the divine outpourings. And that two, before embarking upon that investigation, let me get the dog out. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. The dog has migrated to the antechamber. So second, before embarking upon that investigation, a prayer must be addressed to the Trinity. Because first and foremost, we must somehow be really conducted to that altitude and be initiated into the mysteries surrounding it. Discussing the good is not a matter of simple discursive reasoning, but of prayer, eўχαῖς, elevation of the mind, ἀνάγεσθαι, and initiation, μυεῖσθαι. In order to reach out to God as the good, a spiritual journey is necessary via a specific kind of prayer, then in the vein of both the Christian and the Platonic traditions. The formal momenta of such prayer are a real upward mobility of the mind, its initiation into the mysteries surrounding God and the union with God. A similar scenario occurs at least in 3 potential Christian sources for Denis's theory: Origen's On Prayer, Saint Gregory of Nyssa's Homilies on the Our Father, and Evagrius Ponticus's On Prayer, while a little more distant Neoplatonic parallels are found in Plotinus's theory of the soul's return into the one. developed in several treatises of the Enneads. Then Iamblichus's explanation of the three stages of prayer as parts of the theurgical process On the Mysteries of the Egyptians, part 5, and Proclus's analysis of the soul's ascension to and union with the gods via prayer in the commentary on Plato's Timaeus. Whilst all these sources have been investigated extensively, a lesser than deserved amount of attention has been dedicated to relevant Syriac sources on the theology of prayer. Guided by hieromonk Alexander Golitzin's and Father Andrew Louth's analyses at Introibo ad altare Dei and Denis the Areopagite, respectively, I would like to look into such 4th century texts as Sermon XII of the Book of Steps, the Persian sage Ephrahat's Demonstration 4, and Saint Ephraim's Hymns on Faith, searching for Syriac antecedents or parallels to Denis's conception of the ontological prayer. This particular point of Dionysian philosophy is, as I shall try to point out, clearly related to the query concerning the divine prohodoi or outpourings. Part 1, a philosophical analysis of part 3, chapter 1 of On the Divine Names concerning the ontological prayer. Part 3 of On the Divine Names is virtually already part and parcel of part 4, in that it introduces and to some little extent adumbrates the main subject matter of part 4, which is the divine name good, agathonumia, in our text. But although Denis does start the discussion of God understood as the good in part 3, that is here, really entering the thick of the matter by putting forward a well-articulated, complex proposition already in the first sentence, 2 obstacles, as it were, immediately pop up and hold off a detailed analysis of the good. One being that before embarking on such an ambitious dialectic project, a prayer to the Trinity seems an absolute must. The other being the necessity of an apology for embarking on it at all, when apparently all has been said and done about it by Denis's master Hierotheus. The divine aspect of the good may be duly investigated only after these duties have been fulfilled. At this point, the duty of a preliminary prayer, at least, may seem like a non-essential detour to us. But at the end of the day, it will turn out to be just the opposite, a precondition of and a full-fledged alternative to systematic philosophical theology. I have said that Denis puts forward a carefully honed formula early on in chapter 1 of part 3. In a first instance, this formula already suggests at least 2 important philosophical points. 1, that the divine name good is totally perfect, panteles, probably precisely because it illuminates every procession or emanation of God, ek phantorike ton holo tuteu prohodo. And 2, that it is precisely on account of the all-inclusiveness of that name that it should be investigated first. The good as a divine attribute is the productive aspect of God, the starting point for the outpourings to come out. In a second instance, then, still in the same opening sentence, Denis also implies that 3, the Trinity is the steward and source of that goodness, which is implied in the agathonumia, and hence it is also beyond goodness as a source. Agatharchike kai hyperagathos, the 2 at the same time. And that 4, the Trinity does reveal all its providential cares, ek phantorike. The name good is 5, therefore something that is analogous with the operation of the Trinity, because both of them are revelatory, ek phantorike, of the divine agency toward vis-a-vis the world, they reveal a creator condescending towards creation. This analogy is hardly surprising if the Trinity is the understructure of the divine aspect of the good. In fact, the Trinity itself has just been described in part 2, chapter 4, as the aspect of the Godhead that displays difference, diakrisis, as compared to the more transcendent divine aspect that displays unity or identity, henosis. Since the identities are like the concealed infinite kernel in God, the metaphysical Ungrund, the divine persons emerge as a more manifestative Grund. So it is tempting to say that for Dennis, author of part 2 of On the Divine Names, the Trinity represents the more outward, creation-oriented facet of the divine infinity. But this is only an anticipation of what is to come in part 4, because the participle epikalesammenoi in the first sentence at once heralds that first a call must go out to the Trinity. This is not a common cry for help, but a being conducted upwards, ἀνάγεσθαι, by virtue of prayers unto the Trinity as a source of goodness. That is, the Trinity as the providential and so more accessible aspect of God. And it implies also an arriving into its more immediate vicinity. One ought to be initiated into the perfectly good gifts surrounding it, as we can see towards the end of the first sentence. This move is far from obvious, for although the Trinity attends to everything in the place where a particular thing is, not everything is capable of leaving their respective metaphysically designated places in the hierarchy of being in order to rise up to the Trinity. That requires individual capacity, willpower, and effort. In principle, also, we may add, this rising up should be controlled by ecclesiastic authority and angelic hierarchy, as the two hierarchies stipulate, referring to the ecclesiastic and the celestial hierarchy of Dennis. We hear of no such intervention here, but Dennis specifies that when our prayers are totally saintly and our mind untroubled and ready for a merger, second sentence, then we have been elevated. Now, it has been pointed out that the operation of mediating powers during the anagoge is remarkably absent from Dennis's narrative here of this elevation of the mind into God. This is so. Even in the two more concrete examples, Dennis gives us of the ontological prayer at the head of the mystical theology, where first he prays the Trinity, then exhorts Timothy to exert himself and ecstatically rise up, literally to be carried up, ἀνάγεσθαι, beyond what is and what is not, with a view to be unified with who is beyond all reality. Now, from a historical point of view, it is not only the ecclesiastic and angelic hierarchies that are missing from this description of immediate contact with the highest one, but also, strikingly, the Proclean Henads are also missing, which in principle should be obligatory stages or checkpoints, places of transition in the journey a lower ranking being lays behind as it ascends to return to its origin by way of a Neoplatonic epistrophe. There is a void, a vacuum in this region for Dennis between the mind and God, which used to be filled up in Neoplatonic metaphysics with the serai, the seamless cords or strings that secure a supervised and inevitable passage bottom up, but also top down, through the Henads toward the One. but as a matter of historical fact, Denis, on the one hand, has revoked the Henads into God. So they essentially have become divine aspects, powers, or outpourings by being eliminated upwards and absorbed into God, back into God. So there no separate intermediary of a divine stature should remain between the highest angelic orders and God. The angels do not have a divine status. This is so even when Denis utilizes the exact term Seira in the same chapter 1 of part 3 of On the Divine Names, with reference to the actines. I think this is on the second and third slide. Let me find. Yeah, Seira is here. Sam, can you see the third slide now?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So Denis uses Seira here with reference to the actines beaming forth from God, because these are probably to be seen as divine outpourings. On the other hand, as far as Proclus's theoi hyperkosmikoi and theoi enkosmikoi, the subject matter of book 5 and 6 of the Theologia Platonica, are concerned, Denis has dragged them down, degrading them into the angelic orders, who have lost all divine attributes and whose only responsibility will be the transfer of divine illumination and saving grace. So I think at this point, at least, the theory of the ontological prayer just borders on the query concerning the prohodoi. Further on in chapter 1 of part 3 of On the Divine Names, it may be pointed out in a similar vein that as Denis still explains that in the course of a Christian prayer, God is not made to descend to our level, but instead we are elevated to the altitude of the Trinity, he may also be tacitly referring to the iamblican theory and practice of theurgy, as it is abundantly described in several passages of Abamon's epistle to Porphyry, better known as De Mysteriis. Just like Iamblichus insists that while the theurge ascends by way of purification, prayer, and sacrifice to the universal demiurge in order to be unified with the highest good, chapter 10, book 10, chapter 6 to 7 in Iamblichus, the involved gods do not suffer any effect or influence. In the same manner, Denis also emphasizes that God doesn't undergo any change during or alteration during our elevation. In section 2.9 of the epistle De Mysteriis, then Iamblichus uses the same verb, kalein, to designate the prayer as Denis, who has epikalein. And still, there may be a tacit opposition on the side of Denis against Iamblichus, because the latter also teaches, Iamblichus in book 4, chapters 1 and 2, that by being unified with a specific God, it is possible to utilize their power to instruct the lower natural forces to execute what the theurge wants. This is certainly not something Denis would own up. After this initial analysis of the Dionysian theory of ontological prayer, let us see if there is something similar to be gleaned from a little earlier Syriac texts, which have been designated by major experts as potential sources of inspiration for Denis, in the context of the proposition that Denis perhaps belongs into a bilingual Syriac historical and cultural context. So I'm coming to my second part, entitled Potential Syriac Sources for the Theory of the Ontological Prayer. First, Afrahat's Tachvito das Luto, demonstration 4 concerning prayer. You can see the area we are talking about, Adiabene and Osroene in specific, in a special, where these early authors probably worked on the borderlands between the Roman Empire and Sasanian Persia. Also, on my next slide, I have highlighted the three most important cities of Amid or Amida, Edessa or Urho in Syriac, today Shanli Urfa, a forgotten town on the border between Turkey and Syria today, and then Nisibin or Nisibis. Also, as you can see, the kingdom of Commagene being indicated on the map, I have just included one slide about this kingdom, which is like forgotten, but you can reach this monumental royal tomb, which belonged to the Commagene kingdom, on top of Nemrut Dağı in Turkey, with steles inscribed in Greek. Incredible. If you travel further into Eastern Anatolia, you'll come to Amida or Amida in ancient Syriac times, as it was called. Today, Turkish Diyarbakır, the major city, something like the capital of Turkish Kurdistan. So this is a Kurdish-speaking area today. Back in time, it was all the northern borderlands of the Osroene. Today, this is the on the left side. You can see like the old city where you have the Syriac community. Today, still dwelling there, like 24 people with the priests who still understand classical Syriac and speak it. But coming back to Afrahat, the so-called Persian sage, he is the author of a collection of epistles designated in Syriac as demonstrations, tahwite. The 4th century Persian Christian sage Afrahat is the first major spiritual writer in the classical Syriac tradition, who is also arguably the first Christian author to write theoretically about prayer without relying exclusively on the Lord's Prayer. His 4th epistle, De Oratione, which is in reality a discourse, concerns prayer, sluto. But besides this, we may also want to draw on demonstration 1, De Fide, as well, which is a discourse on faith, because there is considerable overlap in the discussion between the two demonstrations. Now, Afrahat stands up for secret prayer, recited in the purity of the heart, Dakyut Lebo. Such prayer, if it is carried out in silence, Shetko, and with a quiet mind, Breyono Shafio, is called pure prayer, Sluto Dekito. At this point, then, we may want to refer to Dennis, who also considers a quiet mind, an epitolotos nous, in the first sentence of part 3 of On the Divine Names, to be a prerequisite of prayer. But this condition is a commonplace, right, in several aphorisms of Evagrius Ponticus II, for instance, in the De Oratione. For Afrahat, pure prayer is thought to have literally supernatural power, hylo, which equals the power of a pure fast. Pure prayer can even have endless power, like the prayer of Moses did, and can be accepted by God as a pure sacrificial presence, kurbono dakyo. Vice versa, pure prayer conveys divine gifts to man in a manner similar to how Dennis conceives of the ending of the mind's itinerary with an initiation into the divine mysteries. Those are Dora, also gifts. For Afrahat too, prayer is an upward journey, though this is more metaphorically stated in demonstration 4 than by Dennis, as Aphrahat utilizes the image of Jacob's ladder leading from here to the heaven in section 5 of demonstration 4. Aphrahat's imagery is even more biblical when he, in section 9, enlarges upon Daniel's prayer in the lion's pit, where he says that as a result of the lion's prayer, a receiver, Makabel, a herald of God, Malakeh, Hebrew, an angel, was sent down from heaven to receive the prayer. Finally, the closing sections of demonstration 4 reiterate the initial demand that prayer should be executed inside your mind, in secret, in a kind of inner chamber, tavono, which is the church of the closed mouth, ahid fumo. The secrecy of prayer recited in a church that is the interior of the human mind is a motive found in a more elaborate and systematic form in the Book of Steps, and in a more poetical form in Saint Ephraim's Hymns on Faith. And so it can be called a common 4th century Syriac metaphor of the theory of prayer. But as far as Dennis is concerned, the common ground which he shares with Aphrahat is reduced to perhaps a too general conception of prayer that requires a quiet mind, that is an elevation to heaven, and that is a conveyor of divine gifts. So let us turn now to the Book of Steps. This 4th century collection of 30 mimre, discourses, is the work of a preacher in the region of the Lesser Zab River. Let me show you on the map. Today, this is northern Iraq. There is one reference on several hundreds of pages to the location where this community lived, whose preacher is presenting to us these texts. That one reference is in the last sermon, where you have this mention of the Little Zab River. Let's go to this area in spirit and have a look at northeastern Iraq, where this monastic community used to live 1.5 millennia ago. And if you look at this following image, you understand why people say that the Middle East is a place where religions are born. Coming now to the text of the Liber Graduum, because it was so baptized by a Hungarian scholar, Dr. Michael Kmosko, a century ago, as he published this source in volume 3 of the Patrologia Syriaca. Coming now to this text, let's have an overview of the topics of the 30 sermons. We will talk about Sermon 12, De Ministerio Ecclesiae Occulto et Manifesto. And before going on, let's just cite a major master of Syriac studies today, Dr. Sebastian Brock. So we anticipate hereby the doctrine of the 3 churches, of which for us, for Dennis, for understanding Dennis, the first 2, the hidden church of the heart and the heavenly church, are the most important. This 4th century collection of 30 discourses is the work of a preacher in the region of the Lesser Zab River, who for some reason took great care to conserve his anonymity. His discourses were addressed to a community of clear-eyed and completely determined ascets who strove after religious perfection. They were called the Gmirei, the perfect ones, whom the collection differentiates from the just, zadike. From this discourse 12, then, for this discourse, then, of churches there is not one but three. The visible church with its ecclesiastic hierarchy, aito dumet, the church that you can see. The church of the heart, aito dolevo, and the invisible celestial church, aito doraumo, literally the church which is on high, in which the anointed one himself, the Messiah, Mashiach, celebrates the divine service. In the church of the heart, the prayer of the heart must be preceded by baptism, evangelical poverty and virginity, and must be complemented by crying, literally crying, fasting and vigil, which are all executed in the course of monastic work, reading of scripture, and prayer. So these three elements constitute monastic life in the Middle East in the 4th century. And if you think of the Pseudo-Macarian homilies, I think especially of homily 19, then you just see a correspondence. Pseudo-Macarius gives us the same description of how monastic life is partitioned into three major parts: work, reading of scripture, and prayer. Only the brother who has accomplished the prayer of the heart is enabled to perceive the church of the heaven with a kind of higher vision. For us, however, students of Denis, a core element is that to believe homily 12, the praying heart is able to go on an ecstatic journey secretly, leave this world behind, and rise up to heaven. This is the secret prayer of the heart. Slutoxito de levo. The soul praying this kind of prayer will ultimately participate in the heavenly sacrifice, celebrated at a heavenly altar. And the final objective of the visible church, indispensable as it is, as a mediator of the sacraments, is only to facilitate this real elevation, which is almost precisely the position Denis occupies in the De Ecclesiastica Hierarchia, opening parts 1 and 2. And at least partially in the theory of ontological prayer. So I'm arguing that the Book of Steps is a horizon, a background into which Denis would fit on two accounts this positioning of the visible church as the entrance gate towards the higher realities by which one must pass. One should not neglect the visible church, the hierarchy, ecclesiastic hierarchy, and so on. But ultimately, the task of those is only to let us go up. And two, in the theory of ontological prayer, there is the same anagogical journey in both the Book of Steps and in Denis. And I'm coming to my last part, Saint Ephraim's hymns on faith, especially, but not only, hymn 20 on faith. For Ephraim, the greatest Syriac author, who has an incredible life work, it's just such an amount of writings that you can hardly ever come to a full understanding of what Ephraim really wrote. So for Ephraim, the perfect prayer should be accompanied by weeping, and it is born only in the heart and never leaves that place unless in the form of an outward creed. The heart, just like for Afrahat and the Book of Steps, is a spiritual organ that functions like a womb, as it brings forth the prayer internally, which in turn brings forth faith externally. Again, just like for Afrahat, and partially also for Dennis, the heart as a place of prayer is like an internal chamber where there is complete quiet and silence. Such dumb prayer, sluto dadlokolo, a prayer which has no voice, is also called a pure rogation, bo auto masalalto, by Ephraim. However, as Ephraim wishes that this prayer should unify the praying person, just unify this person, he hardly alludes to a Proclean unification, to be sure, a kind of henosis in the Proclean sense, but rather to what he describes in the middle stanzas of hymn 20 as the moral split of the soul caught up between good and evil, which is a fundamentally different concept. However, in several other hymns of the same collection, Hymni de Fide, we'll find a very instructive, a very strong instruction that God's infinity can never be grasped, so we should give it up. She should give up that query, should renounce of that, because to Ephraim's mind, and this is something which he has in common with Dennis, I think, God is always in front of us. God somehow always cuts in front. So that is a motive which Ephraim, Dennis, both of them share with Cappadocian theology, Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, and which should be regarded as somehow a common good of all these authors. My conclusion is that if we really want to situate the Dionysian doctrine of the ontological prayer in a historical context, after having passed in review the Neoplatonic sources, the Cappadocians and Origen and Evagrius Ponticus, and the Syriac sources, which are potentially important, then the upshot is that the most important author for Dennis is just Evagrius Ponticus, especially De Oratione, in terms of the theory of the ontological prayer, because there is the most overlap in terms of individual doctrines. You know, this is a complex idea of what the ontological prayer is. And so the background for this theory of the ontological prayer is more in the direction of Evagrius Ponticus than in the direction of the Syriac fathers, although there are serious sort of meeting points or overlaps which are shared in common by Dennis and the Syriac fathers. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nicholas. Alex, I think, do you want to field questions for Dr. Vassányi?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Vassányi, for your presentation. If you have a question, please use hand feature, and we will call on you.
I don't know how to use the hand raise feature, but I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So you're talking about how in Divine Names 3, prayer can rise to the Trinity without any mediating powers. I wonder how this relates to, once you get into chapter 4, the discussion of the soul's movement, which has 3 stages. First, turning away from things outside, then joining to the higher powers, which seems to be the angels. And then from there, the mind ascends to the beautiful and the good. So does the account of prayer that is invoked prior to the discussions in chapter 4 also have to go through the same process of the movement of the soul, or is it something before that, something different?
That's a pretty difficult question. Thank you for highlighting the difference. As to the status of prayer in general, you know, the ultimate outcome of on the divine names is that systematic theology will never be able to capture the essence of God. God somehow always cuts in front, like our shadow always precedes us. That's an image Gregory of Nazianzen has. So I have the impression that the place, the position Dennis keeps up or designates for prayer is a full alternative to a systematic, positive or negative theology. So let me start with this, that, you know, the outcome of On the Divine Names is that we have passed in review all these names and have argued at length for their validity, causality, and so on. But this was in vain. That's in part 13, chapter 3, where Dennis gives up. So that ultimately, the treatise On the Divine Names is a treatise which sort of destroys itself. It is a discourse which deconstructs itself. And the outcome is, okay, we just have to go a different way. And I suspect that different way is the way of prayer. Now, that's as a kind of introduction into the general positioning of what prayer is as an alternative to systematic philosophical theology. But more concretely, to your question, of course, on the one hand, we have a full text, a full work, the celestial hierarchy, which, you know, just describes, that just tells us that there is this sort of seamless continuum, whose task is to lead us upwards. And it is certain that, in principle, you cannot pass them by. You cannot go a different way. You must go through the ecclesiastic hierarchy. That's very clear in the ecclesiastic hierarchy, and then through the celestial hierarchy. But my point is that here in chapter or part 3, I prefer to call these parts and then go chapter by chapter inside the parts. So in part 3, my point is you don't have that. You don't have that either in the opening paragraph of the mystical theology. You remember that that's a short prayer, one paragraph. And there's no question of, you know, why don't the angelic hierarchy intervenes? Let me help, let them help me, huh? No, the Trinity, oh, hyperagathē, you know, triad, please help me go up. And so there are these two passages part 3 of one of the divine names and part 1 of, or chapter 1 of the mystical theology, when you have no reference to the mediating structure, which otherwise should be there and should help us. So I don't know what the real explanation for this is, but probably there is no incompatibility. So then it just has a shorter version and a more full and a fuller version.
Seems like this lack of incompatibility might agree with the fact that the series of mediations that we get in book 4 is the result of prayer. It's Hierotheus's prayer that results in communicating the more systematic mediation. So it seems like rather than an alternative of prayer versus the more systematic presentation, they're somehow linked in harmony, and the figure of Hierotheus as the one who communicates the content of the divine names as a result of prayer. That maybe that would be a link that would help explain, but I'll let others ask a question.
Thank you.
We have another question from Sam. Sam, you go ahead on it.
Great, thank you. Also, just before I ask the question, in the spirit of conversation, please feel free to show your video if you can, just in the spirit of conversation, yeah. But I just wanted to ask, I'm curious about the justification, Nicholas, thank you for your paper, regarding perfect prayer, including weeping. I was just curious, what role would what you might call moral lessons play in prayer? So I'm thinking about like a story from the lives of the saints. Would that not be considered a kind of prayer? And I ask because obviously a story from the lives of the saints is an inspiring story. It's a kind of, it's not quite a story that generates weeping, at least maybe not initially. So anyway, I was just kind of curious about the justification for saying perfect prayer includes weeping and how that might relate to more inspiring stories. Yeah.
I'm kind of hard of hearing and I forgot to have my headphones. Would you please repeat the essential point? And I'm leaning more. Yeah,
the essential point is aren't inspiring stories from the lives of the saints, aren't those a kind of prayer? And yet those don't include weeping. So I understand those maybe not or maybe are not perfect prayers, but I'm just kind of curious what makes one prayer perfect. Why does it necessarily include weeping? That's guess what I'm wondering. Yeah.
Do you have a particular author in mind? Are you referring to the Book of Steps or Afrahat or Ephraim?
No, I don't. Yeah, just in general, if you could give a sense a little bit of in Ephraim, perhaps the justification. Yeah.
And then your question is what the momenta are of such a perfect prayer, whether weeping is necessarily a part of it, and whether there is a link that relates this concept with the reading of stories. Have I understood you well? Of the Bible? Is this the point?
Yeah,
you
yeah.
Also write your question in the chat window, then I'll perfectly understand. Let's do that, please, because yeah, I would need my headphones and then.
Well, perhaps yeah,
just right.
Okay, yeah.
Let's do that, please. Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Well, okay. Let me see.
In the chat window.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding you here.
This is a real physical handicap of mine, hearing impairment. I'm sorry.
Okay, so what is the justification for saying perfect prayer always includes weeping? when stories from the lives of the saints are also a kind of prayer, perhaps, and
Okay.
we are happy in a certain way. Maybe not.
Now
totally.
I have understood. I have
Yeah.
understood.
Okay.
So, yeah. Yeah, well, yes, that's complex. You have at least, well, several, not only 3 or 4, but several important sources which describe early monastic life in the Middle East. Some of them in Greek, some in Syriac. And so there's a considerable overlap, but not all the accounts are identical. And so if you think of the Pseudo-Macarian homilies, I think in homily 19, but I may be mistaken, but it's not difficult to find. There's actually almost a full homily, an entire homily on prayer. That's also interesting to consider. That's a Greek source. So he says that prayer and reading the scriptures and work are 3 different occupations of the monks. So that when you have prayed, and Macarius, Pseudo-Macarius specifies, when you have prayed for 6 hours, all right, okay? When you have prayed for 6 hours, then you may want to go on and do something else, like reading the Bible. And when you have done that, maybe for 6 hours again, you may go and you may want to work. And so there's not necessarily an overlap between praying and reading. For at least, for instance, at least for Pseudo-Macarius, prayer is quite meditative, and reading scripture is not part of it. But as to another part of your question, weeping comes to the fore in Ephraim very much, and in Afrahat very much, and in the Book of Steps, there's a separate homily. I think, let me check. You can read it. You know, I think there's an English translation so available. That's homily 18, De Lacrimis Orationis. So these major 4th century sources do think that weeping, crying is just part of your everyday routine as a monk. If you don't have that, that may be a missing part, something that is missing from your perfect prayer. So that's an expression of your understanding that you're a sinner, isn't it? You weep because of your sins. And if you don't have that, you don't have a pure heart. Other than that, you must also go fasting, do the vigil, do alms, and pray, and then you will become perfect, gmir or gmiro. And then, you know, these very determined early Syriac monks just wanted to be like the Christ without any reservations. So that's a very serious attempt at homoiosis theo imitatio Christi, with no, without any qualifications.
Thank you for answering our questions. If you have our questions, unfortunately, we're out of time. But if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email Dr. Vassányi.
Or email me and I can send it to Miklós. Yeah.
Yes. Please email us. Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have.
Yeah. So thank you, Nicholas, and please, thank you very much for presenting. Yeah. So we'll just take about 5 minutes here, and then we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock for the next presentation.